Hello and welcome to Dialogue. China has released a white paper on China's legal framework and measures for counterterrorism. The document states that as a victim of terrorism, China has always stressed the importance of law-based counterterrorism efforts and has enhanced its work by following international conventions and treaties while amending and improving criminal laws. What are some of the highlights of the white paper and how has China conducted its counter-terror campaign over the past decade? And what has contributed to the success of the anti-terror efforts in China's Xinjiang Uygur Autonomous Region? Join us for our discussion live today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Dalu, Assistant Professor from the School of Human Rights at the Southwest University of Political Science and Law, Victor Gao Zhikai, a Chair Professor from Soochow University, and Andy Mok, Senior Research Fellow with the Center for China and Globalization. Thank you for joining us. I will start with Professor Dalu. Let's first take a look at the white paper. Tell us, what are the highlights of the white paper? What impressed you the most?
Okay, thanks, Qinduo, for your question. I mean, for me, from my personal perspective, I think the highlight part of this white paper, which released today, is about, the white paper today released is about 5 parts, right? And the second part is about clear provisions on determination of and the punishment of terrorist activities. I think this part is we need to highlight it. And the reason why I think it's important also, it is because, as a legal professor, it is very important to tell apart what kind of activities are violation of law and what kind of activities are crime. And because different activities will use different or employ the different laws, such as the in the counterterrorism activities, if these activities we consider as a crime, then we will use the crime law and the crime procedure law, and if it's just a crime, it's just a violation of law, then we will use administrative penalty. That's enough. So this is part. It's very important. Also highlight part. So we tell apart different or different parts or different activities will employ different laws, and also the most impressed me part is about the human rights protection, because each country nowadays in the world are facing the risk of terrorist attacks, not only in China. So no one country can stand alone, and this is also the reason why lots of countries, not only in China, adopted such kind of counterterrorism acts or law. Just name it, like UK and the United States as well. And however, in this kind of country, they will emphasize the protection of the suspect's rights.
Mm-hmm.
However, the victims' rights and the other parts and the stakeholders' parts, their rights will be, how to say that word? Not respected well. So in our counterterrorism legal framework, we not only protect the suspect's rights, but also the victim rights and also other parts their rights.
Yeah.
So it's kind of balanced.
Yeah, rights protection is also important. So Andy, counter-terror efforts is not only about the security, but also protecting the rights protection of the victims as well as those suspects. But I remember that it used to be the case. There are debates like how to fight terror. For example, like in the United States, some people would insist you rely on activities like intelligence collection, and you use the police. You do the work, and then you do targeted crackdown. And then there are other people, or of course there are the wars. You launch wars against certain countries or certain group to fight terror. So how do you characterize the Chinese practice, in fighting terrorism?
I think that's a very great point that you raised, Tingduo. So my understanding is with this white paper, the definition of terrorism is the intentional use of violence or intimidation to accomplish political, ideological, religious, or even economic goals. And here I agree with Dalu that what's very significant about China's approach is that it's very clear at delineating what is a terrorist act and what is not, as well as protecting the rights of individuals at the same time. And to me, this really demonstrates, it's the latest example of China's approach to important problems by taking a comprehensive and integrated approach that focuses on the immediate acute problem. So here would, of course, be violence or intimidation from terrorism, but also addressing the root causes as well, whether that's economic deprivation, being a victim of extremism, but also to post-terrorist acts as well. So there's a section on rehabilitation as well. So I think this is an important milestone in China's broader national security efforts, which I think we'll probably talk about a little bit more. Why is this happening now? But it also, I think, again, demonstrates this holistic, very finely calibrated and holistic approach to a very important problem that not only affects China domestically, but we have to recognize, too, that terrorism is a trans-border, cross-border problem as well. And China's approach also allows it to integrate with efforts to fight terrorism at a multilateral level, say at the UN, as well as working with other countries around the world.
Well, Victor, could you help elaborate a little bit about the evolution, the rationale of the legal architecture in China, supporting these measures, policies to fight terrorism?
Thank you very much. I agree, generally speaking, to the important comments made by the two previous panelists. I would say this white paper is an important exercise in coming up with an overarching framework of defining what terrorism is, who are the terrorists, what are the acts of terror, as Andy just now mentioned, but also to emphasize that terrorism itself does not exist in a vacuum. There are root causes to terrorism, and also terrorism normally does not just exist in one country. It has an international connection to it, and China wants to be proactive in identifying terrorism, dealing with terrorism heads along, and try to deter terrorism, and also deal with the consequences of terrorism of all respects. Now, in this way, this white paper is a very important exercise because it will help the Chinese people and the Chinese nation and the government entities and all the law enforcement agencies, you name it, to come to grips with what exactly is terrorism, not only in the overall Chinese legal framework, but also in reference to other countries' experiences, because terrorism sometimes exists across border, for example, and for the terrorism that China has suffered from, especially in Xinjiang, it has indeed an overseas or international dimension to it. All this, I think, should be covered by this white paper, and eventually it will enable the Chinese people as a whole, the Chinese government entities, the regulators, the law enforcement agencies, to be better prepared in dealing with terrorism and dealing with the root causes of terrorism as well as the consequences of terrorism. The goal is very clear: to free the whole society and the general population of China from the menace of terrorism, because this terrorism is indeed a curse to the general public in China, but it is also a curse to many other countries and communities in all other parts of the world. Therefore, I think this white paper is indeed an enabling exercise to help us, everyone here in China, to come to better grips in dealing with terrorism.
Well, Victor, China enacted its counterterrorism law in 2015, basically after, let's say, since it launched this anti-terror efforts in 2014 in Xinjiang. Over the past about 7 years, we haven't seen any incidents of terror in Xinjiang. Can we say now it's a very successful effort, practice of law, practice of comprehensive efforts in this region against the terror?
Well, first of all, I think that the Anti-Terrorist Act in itself is a success, especially if we measure it by the occurrence of very serious terrorist attacks in China, which are not being detected, for example. On the other hand, I think anti-terrorism should also be measured in other ways. For example, the overall stability in the society at large and how people from both China and outside of China will look at the situation, whether everyone really will agree with us that the situation is stable, or whether there are other causes which need to be dealt with, for example. Therefore, I think this white paper really wants to achieve an additional goal. That is to move one level upward, to define the whole situation not only as terrorism in itself, but overall arching view of terrorism, dealing with the root causes, the consequences, and also to pay better attention to protecting the legitimate human rights of each of the individuals in China. Therefore, I think it is more balanced in dealing with terrorism as a whole. We need both the law itself as well as whatever that is being talked about, discussed, stipulated in this white paper to make sure that while terrorism need to be dealt with as it is by all the forces that the Chinese government and the society at large can muster together, we also need to be very careful in protecting the legitimate human rights and the privacy considerations of each and all of the people in China. These two things need to be well balanced off, and protecting one should not be happening at the expense of the others.
Yeah, that's right. It's multiple factors in the process. Professor Dalu, if you look at the Chinese efforts, some would describe that as multifaceted efforts. You have anti-poverty program, for example, to lift people out of poverty, increase their living standard. You have projects to create jobs for young people, and you have programs to help young people better access to education. So tell us more about this, kind of like a very comprehensive approach in fighting terrorism.
Okay, thank you, Chindu. So I will tell you something because actually the experience, the counterterrorism experience told us that if we just put someone, in the jail and the terrorist will not, it will still existed, and we need a comprehensive approach to counterterrorism. And the Xinjiang and the other parts of China, the practice shows that if you have a better education for the kids, for the children, and also to create a local job for the people in Xinjiang and other parts of China as well, it will help them to, like you as mentioned before, to anti-property and to to make the better life, and that's is very important because previously in Xinjiang, why lots of terrorist attacks happened there? It is because of the extremists, and the reason why it happened is also because of the will not create a better condition for them to schooling, to educating the kids, and also to offer the property jobs for them. And if you offer the property job for them and also to educating kids, this is a much better way to emulate this kind of terrorism in Xinjiang and in outside of China as well.
Yeah.
So that's very important. Yes.
Right, de-radicalization, and of course, stay away from those extreme ideas, ideology. Andy, earlier you mentioned you call this a holistic approach. Tell us, why it is necessary for China to follow this, or why are the reasons, China chooses to follow this, practice this holistic approach to deal with the threat from terror?
Sure. Well, I think Xinjiang is an excellent case study of exactly as you say, Qingduo, how a holistic, multifaceted approach can be very effective. And the other thing I want to add here is restraint is also very, very important. So we've seen recently another terrorist attack. And what happens when you respond without restraint and you respond in a disproportionate way?
So you're referring to the Gaza conflicts, right?
Gaza, exactly. Yeah. And then what happens then is you actually make the problem worse and you create even more future terrorists. And I think what has been shown by the test of time, Qingduo, with Xinjiang, is because we're quite a few years away from those terrorist attacks, is that by following this multifaceted approach, of course, capturing, dealing with the people that actually perpetuated violent crimes, but as we heard, dealing with the economic aspects, the extremist ideology, and very importantly, I think, having a path for rehabilitation. So people, if they were, of course, there's some that were directly involved in violent crime, some that played a contributory accessory role, but you provide an appropriate path, rehabilitation for people. That is really a long-term solution, and I think this is again, a great case study that shows how China's approach of being holistic, multifaceted, but also demonstrating restraint, looking to really solve the problem in a dispassionate way and not necessarily looking for vengeance, is very, very important. And I think this is, shows a kind of political maturity as well, I would say, Qingduo.
Well, Professor Dalu, obviously, anti-terror, the fight against terror is not only in China but also across the world, as Victor earlier said. Then, looking into the future, the near future in particular, what are the challenges for the Chinese government, for China, to deal with terror and to maintain peace and stability? Now, that's a hard one, let's say, in some parts of the country, especially in Xinjiang, for example.
Actually, in today's release, the white paper already showed that the success of our counterterrorism. But however, I think the biggest challenge for the counterterrorism is not from domestic. It's not a domestic one or internal one. It's much more like an international one, as other two panelists already mentioned that. Nowadays, we are I'm kind of like familiar with this word, village, right? So, no country can, in this world, today, to stand alone, not not facing the risk of the terrorism. So we need to make this kind of international cooperation. This is very important. To cut off this kind of connection, the internal terrorists and also the outside or international terrorists. And this is one side. And the other part is the reason why we actually, this is second white paper for us to on the topic of the counterterrorism. The reason why we are to repeatedly to publish this kind of white paper is we want to tell the world a truth, a simple truth. We are doing this kind of counter-terrorism operation or campaign. It is because the terrorist attacks is happening in China. I still can remember. I still can remember that in 2014, the terrorist attacks in Yunnan Kunming railway station square, right? I was in Slovakia in that moment, and I cannot imagine that in Yunnan, I was there in 2013, 1 year before, and there is a very peaceful city, Yunnan, Kunming. So I cannot imagine that terrorist attacks happen there. So as you know that the counterterrorism campaign followed this kind of like different approaches, and the terrorist attack is not exist, or this kind of things is not existed in China and for a long year, and the social panic is no more exist as well. So I mean the young people can go outside. This is also very important. I mean, like the freedom of feel free. So that is also very important,
Yeah, the
and
sense.
that's I think is very important. Also, this is how we uh, like to tackle this kind of challenges on counterterrorism.
Right, that sense of security, sense of safety is like air. You don't notice until you lose that. That's why the fight against terror is important. Speak of the challenges, Victor. We know that, as Professor Dalu said, it's not domestic, but mostly, let's say, international or from our side. In particular, I think it's easy to understand the double practice, double standard. For example, somehow like, terror in China is not terror. Especially in the case of Xinjiang, we know like Xinjiang mostly the ETIM, I think East Turkestan Islamic Movement, that was listed. That is still on the list of the UN as a terror organization. Of course, the Chinese government designated this organization as a terror organization. But even the US did that. But in 2020, they removed the organization from the terror list. Somehow, recognizing instead as a normal organization. What do you make of that? This kind of lack of cooperation probably in jointly crack down against terror.
Well, the irony of international cooperation against terrorism is that there are some countries which call a spade when it applies to itself, or call a spade by another name when it's applied to another country. Now, we all know that in China, we put a premium on stability and security, and there is a law, mandatory education for kids, for example, and no one, including their parents, have any legal right to prevent the kids from going to school. Now, in Xinjiang, for example, there are such incidences where people want to prevent the kids, especially girls, from going to school under whatever name, whatever excuse. That's against the law. Now, some people may say, well, it is against my human rights or it's deprivation of my privacy. I do not want to see my kids going to school, etc., etc. But in reality, that's against the PRC law to prevent any kids, especially girls, from going to school. We need to tell the whole world what's the real story. There are such phenomena, and these phenomena do not constitute any excuse for any country, including the United States, to whitewash the underlying terrorist activities and to falsify the situation in Xinjiang. I think everyone in Xinjiang wants to have peace and stability, not only in their own family, but in the society at large. And no one really wants to tolerate the occurrence of terrorism, extreme violence, or preventing the kids from going to school. I think, despite of all the difficulties, promoting international cooperation, forming up a real united front against terrorism of all kinds, all shapes, all colors, for example, will be absolutely important. Because once you divide and rule, once you lose this eagerness and commitment to solidarity, then the winner will be the terrorists. And societies in different countries will suffer the consequences of terrorism. And it's a very ironic incentive for more violence and more acts of terrorism against innocent people in different countries. China wants to promote international cooperation against terrorism, and I hope other countries, especially the United States and other developed countries, in Europe included, for example, will join China in such commitment to improve international cooperation against terrorism rather than being divided, enabling terrorism to win rather than terrorism to be defeated.
Well, Andy, of course, we know that there's a complicated relationship between Washington and Beijing, in particular, Washington's, let's say, tough policy on China, since they concern or anxiety, China will replace the U.S. to become the #1 country. Some say that has prompted Washington, to politicize this anti-terrorism issue. For example, they have been, accusing China of quote unquote, genocide in Xinjiang, despite, the population growth, despite the peace and stability in that region. What do you make of that?
Well, Tingduo, this is not a new thing. But I think what is important to point out here is that terrorism, these other issues you raised, are very important in and of themselves. But more broadly, I think what this represents is a broad-based national security challenge that is facing China. And we, of course, have seen the government enunciate the importance of national security. And we see this in a number of different ways. The Ministry of State Security taking a more public role, recently launching a public WeChat account, educating the public about the different dangers of espionage. China more broadly recognizing that national security is more than just military security, but as you mentioned, technological security, economic security, environmental security, even cultural security as well. So, I think we can see this counterterrorism white paper as important not only in and of itself, but also as recognition that more generally national security needs to be prioritized. In China, we went through a long period of focusing on primarily economic development and perhaps overlooking some other things that have caused big problems around the world. Look at color revolutions, etc. And I think now we're seeing a shift to emphasizing a greater importance of national security, exactly in response to these issues you raised, Tingduo.
But Andy, with this kind of the practice of double standards, of course, and also geopolitical elements consideration, are we seeing like a less united efforts or international efforts against terror? What kind of consequences that will have? Briefly.
Yeah, I think it's on two tracks, Tingduo. So where there are common threats, I think obviously China and the U.S. Will work together. But at the same time, the U.S. is looking to win this discourse battle as well. And I think we're witnessing with social media the increasing difficulty of promoting these false narratives.
Yeah, false narratives. So Professor Dalu, what's probably the right response or the proper response to this kind of, let's say, almost like like narratives, negative narratives, or attacks, or smear campaign against China?
Okay, that's a good question. This kind of like, let's make it very short and simple. We're now just to tell the world a simple and very important truth. What we're doing now in Xinjiang, in other side of other parts of all the region of China, is to counter terrorism, and within the rule of law or law-based governance, and as other parts. So,
right. Yeah, following the law and protect the human rights.
Follow the law. Yes.
Well,
it's not like the.
Right. With that, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.